Okay, so we're just gonna get started in 1 minute. Just give me.
Right.
Make sure this is working. Okay, all right, so I think we're live now. YouTube. Okay, so I'm gonna start the recording and I will give you the hosting rights. So there are a few people on the Zoom call here, so they can ask questions, most likely in the chat. And that should be it. Okay, all right, so I've made you the host, and so you can end the call once you're done. Okay, so you can get started.
Okay, great. All right. Hi, everyone. So we're looking at one of the games I've selected. It's a game that should teach you some things about being patient and how to treat your position when you're totally dominating your opponent. Things like taking time and not rushing. So the way I like to do it is while I'm teaching, ask questions. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. So I'll be looking out for that. So make sure if you want to say something, just put in the chat and I will enter it. So can someone just write something so I can make sure you can hear me in the chat? Okay, great. All right, so I can see your chat too. All right, so let's go ahead and start. So today's game is between Boris Gelfand and Wang Yui. This is a pretty famous game. I think Gelfand wrote about it in his book about positional chess. And yeah, so Gelfand is a really strong player, really solid positional player. He's the kind of player who can really play the long game and is comfortable playing, 80, 90 move grinds. And this is one of those type of games. He did what he does best. And we'll take a look at how he is able to not rush and execute his plan without, letting his opponent really have any counterplay. So the game started with d4, d5, c4, c6. So, top level chess, very solid opening, Slav, knight c3, knight f6, and e3. So with e3, white's defending the c4 pawn, but also locking his bishop inside the pawn chain, basically preventing any d takes c4 Slav coming up pretty soon. And Wang Yi plays a6. So this is, I think, pretty trendy either now or it was like 4 or 5 years ago. But this is the Chebenenko Slav. With a6 very early on in the opening, it was kind of weird. You're not developing a piece, but the point of this line is for black to play b5 really early and, kind of ask white, what will you do with the c4 pawn? Like, do you want to take, let black bring his pawn towards the center, or do you want to push c5, locking up the queen side? So yeah, black is trying to gain space on the queen side and make sure that white doesn't have his usual, plus equals kind of position. Although after c5, white will still have a space advantage on that side of the board. So knight f3, just developing, pretty normal, and b5. So immediately black is asking white, what do you do with the c4 pawn? In this game, white decided to play c5, pretty normal. b3 is also possible, trying to maintain the pawn at c4 and keep the tension. Both are very popular, but in this game, Gelfand chose c5. Now, in a queen's gambit, type position, wherever white goes c5, you build up a massive pawn chain on the queen side, right? You gain a bunch of space and you control some nice squares. But the drawback is that you're releasing control of the center, right? Like you're not putting pressure on d5 anymore. And that means, with the release of the tension in the center, black wants to gain some control on that side of the board. So in this kind of position, the pawn break black wants is to play e5, right? Because if he can play e5, and if white ever takes, then the c5 pawn becomes a huge problem now because it's so far in black's territory that defending it becomes a huge issue. So if black can go e5 safely, white usually has a difficulty taking the pawn without worrying about c5. And if white doesn't take on e5, then black will go e4. And this pawn chain will be a real monster. So Yeah, black wants to go for e5 now. The problem is white controls e5 pretty well at the moment, right? And black needs to figure out how to develop his pieces in a way that can control e5. So instead of going like normally e6, trying to develop the bishop on e7, where it's not doing that much, to be honest, black goes g6 instead. Because on the long diagonal, the bishop could help out with e5 at some point. So it makes sense for black to develop the bishop on this diagonal. He could have also gone like, bishop to g4 or something, trying to trade off the bad bishop with all these pawns and light squares. So yeah, there are many options, although I think g6 is pretty sensible. And Gelfand knows that black wants to go for e5 right away. At least after he castles and gets the pieces out. So instead of developing normally like bishop e2, bishop d3, this is all fine. Gelfand plays kind of ambitiously, trying to really control e5. And he does that with knight to e5. This does break some rules, right? Moving the same piece twice in the opening, but he has a good reason to, right? If black can never play e5, then he'll be really passive, right? Like look at white's space advantage on the queen side. He has so much more space there, and if black doesn't fight back in the center, or maybe even the king side, then it looks like he's just going to have a hard time developing and finding space for his pieces. So white's ambitious play has some merit to it. Okay, bishop g7 and f4. So really just putting a clamp on e5 and making sure black will never be able to control that square. And now black goes a5. So a5 is totally fine. It prevents white from having one idea on the queen side. Whenever there's like this kind of lock structure on the queen side with like a6 and b5, a lot of times what white wants to do is, okay, let's say for example black does something kind of random like h5. White tries to go like a4 sometimes, right? Putting pressure on the a file, and black should go b4. But let's say for some reason he doesn't, right? Let's say he goes, I don't know, bishop b7, because at the moment we're threatening a takes b5 with the pin on the a file, right? So he's got to defend his rook. So let's say bishop b7, defending the rook. Then white goes b4. White ends up getting this, he gets more space for his pawns, right? And he also fixes black's pawns on these squares, right? They're stuck on white squares. The bishop on b7 is on a white square, so it can't really move. And now with the pawn on a4, there's always like this pending threat of a takes b5 and some kind of rook penetration on the a file, right? So this gives white some leverage on the queen side, and there's no reason for black to just give white all these queen side moves for free, right? So that's why black just goes a5, controlling the b4 square, and making sure white can never really do that. No a4 nonsense anymore. Also, black could have an idea of b4 one day himself, trying to open things up on the queen side. So after a5, white goes just bishop b2, developing, queen c7, developing. I guess he wants to defend c6 so he can move his knight out. Very logical. Castles, and now castles. So both sides have castled, they've developed. And yeah, now that both sides have castled, black kind of has an annoying threat in this position. So black is really solid here. He has hardly any weaknesses. He just has less space, right? White has more space, but there is one weakness in white's position. So what square does white have that's kind of a weakness here? You can just put your answer in the chat, and then we'll take a look at it. Yeah, the d4 square, right? White's played both d4 and f4, which makes d4 square a weakness, right? White only has one piece defending it, the knight. So if black can force knight to move away and then go knight to e4, he's doing pretty well, right? He can go knight to e4, then go f6, kick white's knight away, and yeah, his pieces will all start to come out very quickly, and we'll have a nice game. The way black does that is by playing b4, right? Black wants to go b4, then play knight to e4, and then maybe even like bishop a6, trading off his really bad bishop in exchange for white's good bishop. So that's why white plays a3, which is a really strong move because it stops b4, so it stops knight to e4, and it stops bishop a6. And yeah, now white gets to keep his control of the e4 square for a while, and Yeah, a3 was probably necessary to make. Otherwise, black would have taken over d4 square. Okay, black goes bishop e6. I'm not sure why he went bishop e6. I think he wanted to go knight to d7 without blocking the bishop. And the way to do that is either bishop e6 or bishop f5, right? Those are the two squares you choose from. Now, bishop f5 is like square you want to go to, right? It's more active. You control the four square, and you have a nice diagonal here for your bishop. The problem is you run into g4, right? And then you got to wonder, like, okay, where do I go now? Do I go bishop e6? Well, I could have gone there in the first place. And this gives white a free move with g4. G4, it looks like it weakens the king because, we're moving our g pawn in front of our king. But white has so much space in the center that black's pieces have a hard time really attacking us, right? So g4, it's actually a good move for white to gain more space. And eventually, white's going to use his kingside pawns to try to launch an attack. So g4 would actually help white here. You can't go to e4 either because I can go g5. And then once your knight moves, I can double your pawns, right? And yeah, this pawn's probably going to be lost to like queen c2. I don't see how black can defend e4 for very long. For example, f5 would lose to queen b3 check and some knight to f7 coming soon. So yeah, bishop f5 runs into some trouble. So that's why black went bishop e6. Okay, but bishop f3, normal. White's trying to control e4, and white keeps developing. I think with bishop f3, white wanted to play g4 right now, but the issue with g4 is that black has knight to e4 now. And this is different because, okay, the pawn gets doubled on e4, but I can go bishop d5 next move, kind of solidifying the pawn, right? And the bishop on d5 is a pretty good piece. It's on an outpost, and look at our knight on e5. It's trapped at the moment, right? Like black goes f6, all the squares are taken. So yeah, this is a little bit of a problem with allowing black to play knight e4 right away. So Gelfand goes bishop to f3, controlling e4 for now. And next move, he wants to go g4. Black goes knight to d7, offering a trade. There's some rules about trading in chess about space. So white's got more space here, that's for sure. So should white take the trade? Or should white play knight to d3 and go back? So just you can write in the chat what you think white should do here. Go back. Yeah, why? White should go back. That's true. White has more space, but why should he go back? Yeah, exactly. Whenever you have more space in chess, you don't want to trade, right? If you think about it, you know, as a house, right? If you have a really big house and if you have a lot of people, it's okay because with the big house, you can fit that many people inside. But if you have a small house and a lot of people, then you're gonna get, some people that are cramped and you won't be able to fit as many people there, right? So the solution is get a bigger house or get less people, right? So you either trade pieces off or you gain more space. So black will love to trade pieces off because that would mean, he's getting more space without upgrading his house, right? And from white's point of view, he doesn't want, you don't want black to have more room for his pieces. So it doesn't make sense to trade when you have more space, right? And that's why white goes back with knight to d3. Also, the knight on e5, a knight that's on e5 is just worth more than a knight on e7 because it controls more squares. And a lot of times you can attribute a value of a piece by how many times it's moved in the opening, right? White's moved the knight 1, 2 times, so that's generally worth more than a knight that's only moved once, right? So you don't want to make a trade with the piece you move many times most of the time. So white goes knight to d3, just avoiding the trade. And in this position, I think black anticipated white's plan of going, g4 and start throwing all his pawns at black and gaining space. So black went h6, which I think is a small mistake actually, because what black is trying to do is he sees the plan and 8-6 is basically saying, okay, I'm gonna buckle down and just try to make a fortress and defend, right? Whenever you're defending, that's usually not a good approach because um, people don't like defending for a long time, right? Eventually, well, usually someone is gonna crack, and sometimes the better way to defend is to be active, right? You want to be a little bit proactive, or at least make your job a little bit easier by getting counterplay or trading pieces off, and that's what Black should have done here. So instead of playing 8-6 right away, a better move would have been bishop f5. Now the point is that if I go g4, you're going to take the knight, and that's one less pair of pieces on the board. So your space probably becomes a little bit easier to manage, right? And now if you want to do your whole 8-6 thing, like, okay, at least here it's a little better because in the other position, you have a bishop on e6, which is not doing anything at all, right? So with this trade, it becomes a little bit easier for Black to manage, and this would have been an improvement. If I'm White, though, I probably go knight to f2 because I don't want to trade, and then I go g4. But now I can play b4, right? Because the knight no longer guards the square, and yeah, there's some counterplay now. Although I think White's still better. It's not like Black is like without counterplay here. So that would have been preferred. Yeah, so 8-6 was played in the game, and now White just goes g4, gaining space. And yeah, you can see all Black's pieces. They just have no squares. Like this knight can't go forwards. The bishop is trapped. This knight can't go forwards. So Black is starting to suffocate a little bit, right? And yeah, already the balance is shifting in White's favor. Black tries knight to h7, trying to make room for his bishop. Probably wants to go f5 at some point and lock up the king side. Black's strategy is to just meet White's pawns with f5 and trying to lock things up on the king side. Generally, locking things up makes you very solid for a while, but you're kind of forfeiting all your counterplay for the rest of the game. And that's a very dangerous way to play because, yeah, you have no counterplay. You're kind of just going to be sitting there at the board for hours and hours, knowing you can't win the game. And it's very boring and also just very hard to defend because humans, they need to be active, right? We're not computers that can defend like insanely long games with perfect play. So practically, this approach doesn't work. It doesn't usually work that much in chess. So okay, what was the alternative? The alternative was bishop f5 earlier, but also Black had one more opportunity. Gelfand went h4 right away, which is very natural, right? You're pushing your pawns, getting more space, and Black went f5, kind of resigning himself to a very boring task. But here Black had a chance to kind of give himself some counterplay here. So it's kind of a sacrifice, but it gives Black some counterplay, and it kind of exposes White on the king side a little bit. Whenever you push pawns really far, they can't go backwards, obviously, right? So the squares behind the pawns start to become weak. So when I play moves like f4, g4, h4, if these pawns like all fall off the board, there's a lot of air on my king, right? So here, Black had the move h5, actually. It is a pawn sacrifice, like White can just take. But the idea is that now the g5 is open. So I'm going to go knight f6, kick you away, and then I go king h8. And then I go rook to g8, and okay, suddenly Black's got counterplay. White's still better because a pawn is a pawn, but Black is not lifeless at all here. Like I can go rook g8, I can go bishop f5, I can bring my knight out, and yeah, it's a game. Your extra pawn is on h4. You can't really push it down the board just yet. It'll probably end up being a target. So White is still very far away from using his extra pawn to win the game. So yeah, h5 would have been the proactive defense, but yeah, Black played f5, and this kind of move like f5, it just makes your bishop a terrible piece for the rest of the game, right? The bishop has no hope of being a good piece ever again, and you also allow g5, which gives White all the space in the world, right? Like look at this pawn chain. You give White the queen side, the center, and now the king side. So you have no counterplay for the rest of the game, and your only hope is that White can never break through, right? So Black takes in the game, which is natural. A lot of people wonder though, why not h5? Okay, we have a question. Could you learn from chess movies? Yeah, probably if the games that they use were pretty instructive ones. Most chess movies don't do it right, but I think there are some that use like real games, real famous games. If you study the games outside of the movie, then you probably would learn more from it than just the movie because, you know, they're mostly in the movie for dramatic effect, right? Um, so yeah, that's my take on learning from chess movies. Okay, back to the game. So yeah, black can try going h5, and it looks like it's a better try because you're locking up the king side, so how can white break through? But in this kind of position where you lock everything up, um, the value of pieces, they're determined by how much space they have, right? And with these guys having so little space, they're not worth that much, right? That means white can try to maybe set up a sacrifice on h5 and use his pawns to hamper the pieces even more. So I'm not saying go bishop takes h5 right now because I want to keep my bishop. The bishop is a really nice piece. So maybe instead of bishop takes h5, we go a little bit slower. Maybe knight e2 first, right? I go knight g3 and I sack the knight instead. Just a sample line would be bishop f7, knight g3, e6, king f2. I'm getting ready to bring all my pieces over, and then I'm going to sack, right? And once I sack, these two pawns will run down the board. And, it looks like a piece sacrifice, like white sacking material, but really, I think these two pawns would be worth just as much of the piece, if not more, because having these two pawns running down the board with your king over there is really, really dangerous, right? Black's pieces have very limited scope to fight back. Rook to b8, bishop d2, queen d8, rook g1, and yeah, it's a very sad position. Like, there's no way you can stop a sack on h5 at some point. I can also take on h5 and then go for g6 even with the fork on your knight and bishop. So yeah, I don't think black can really hope to defend this position by playing h5 either. So that's why in the game, instead of h5, black just took on g5. And yeah, there's no more sack on h5, but now the h5 is open, right? So probably at some point, white is going to double up his rooks over there, right? And try to crash through. Black goes king f7. So he's trying to run his king over to the center, maybe the queen side even, and also give his rook access to the h file. So this is a pretty fast way of trying to anticipate white's rook h1 idea. If black keeps his rook, keeps his king on the king side, like bishop to e6 or bishop to f7, what do you think white's plan is here? How does white try to break through? Yeah, we want to double rooks on the h file anyway. It doesn't really matter where the king goes for now because the h file is the only avenue for attack, right? So white's still going to double up the rooks, just king g2, move the queen, move the bishop, and then double up, right? Leaving the king on g8 is probably going to make the defense even harder because, well, right now black's pieces just aren't set up in a good enough way to defend, right? He needs a bishop on g8 or something to control h7, but it's going to be on f7 stuck here. So in the game, black tries to set up a better way to anticipate white's attack. So after king f7, what he's trying to do is probably bring his king over to e8 and then bring the bishop back. And with the bishop participating in the defense, he has one extra piece to control the h file with. So yeah, that's why I went king f7, just trying to get an improved version of leaving the king on g8. Okay, king g2. Yeah, again, rook h1 is coming, the only way to attack. Rook to b8, bishop to d2, developing, and knight to f8. So it looks like what black is trying to do is just control all the squares in the h file, right? The bishop guards these two squares, the knight guards this square, and he can bring up more pieces to the king side to, help the knight and the bishop. So probably bishop g8, reinforcing h7 even more. Bishop e2. Okay, so now we're entering the phase of the game where white has a space advantage and black has no counterplay, right? This is a position that kind of leads us to the topic for today, where your opponent is basically helpless, right? If you're white here, you shouldn't be scared of anything, right? Black has no counterplay at all. So you're kind of free to do what you want, within reason, right? You can take as much time as you want to develop, to maneuver your pieces. So that means you should put them on the absolute best squares that you can, right? You have all the time in the world to arrange your setup. So you should find the best setup possible. And once you have that setup, then you can finally crash through. So notice how Gelfand takes a lot of his time just finding the best square for his pieces. He doesn't deliver like any serious blow for a very long time. So right now we're just setting up our pieces for the attack. King e8, knight to e1. So we're starting with a maneuver. Where's this knight going? It's going to f3. So on f3 we can control e5. We can go to h4 possibly and target g6, which is probably black's weakest pawn. So yeah, we don't even know if it's going to be the best piece on f3. It could be fine on d3, but just playing moves, it also asks your opponent, what are you going to do in response to my plan? And then you can use that information later to change your setup and ask that question again and again. So yeah, nothing wrong with taking your sweet time trying to figure out where the pieces will go in a position like this. Black goes bishop g8 finally, trying to control all the h-file squares so white cannot break through with the rooks. Knight to f3, rook to b7, and bishop d3. So again, just slowly improving every piece, right? We're not rushing, we're just improving every piece little by little. Knight to b8. So yeah, when you're in black situation here, you're kind of just sitting around waiting. You have a plan, of course, but there's not much you can do, right? Like black's plan is to just defend and respond to white's threats. So when you have to find a waiting move, you end up playing moves like knight to b8. Although here, black could also be trying to just play e6 and open up the 7th rank for his rook. So moves like knight to b8, they're not very pretty, but there's really not much black can do here, right? Knight to e2. Okay, so this is probably the first non-obvious move that I see in this position, right? Why remove the knight from c3? Where is it going? And it's not so clear right away. So after knight to e2, where do you think the knight is going right now? Is it going to the king side or some other path on the queen side, do you think? The queen side? Okay. What's the path you would take? What squares? Knight c1 to b3. Okay, yeah. And you want to target a5. Yeah, that's a good observation because a5 is a pawn that is not defended by a pawn, right? So it could be a target later. And if we force black to play a4, then we gain a square on the queen side. So knight c1 and b3 is definitely an idea for sure. Yeah, so keep that idea in mind. It could be useful later. At the moment, black has a rook and queen defending a5 and potentially another rook, right? So black wants to keep the pawn on a5. If necessary, he'll play rook to a7, rook b to a7, and reinforce a5. So at the moment, knight c1 to b3, it wouldn't force a response from black right away, a committal response like a4. So instead of going to the queen side, for now, Gelfand wants to go to the king side. He wants to go to g3 and kind of scare black into a piece sacrifice with f5, right? Maybe he also wants to reroute to some other square. Black always has to look out for kingside sacrifices like knight takes f5, knight h4 takes g6. That's another one, because if you even allow a piece sack for 2 pawns, right, the passed pawns will just be a total headache to deal with. So Black will probably go e6, trying to control f5. So first queen d8, clearing the 7th rank for the rook, and knight to g3, attacking the f5 pawn. And if it were white's move here, I would immediately take on f5, right? Because then I get some nice passed pawns, and yeah, I wouldn't think too much about it because black pieces are so bad that I'm not worried about sacking a piece here for those 2 pawns. Black goes e6, stopping it right away, and now rook to h1. So the knight on g3, okay, we brought it to g3, but it's not so clear what it's doing now, right? F5 has been protected, so maybe it needs to be moved somewhere else again. And yeah, we can do that later as well. Again, white has all the time in the world. Black has no counterplay, so we can take as much time as we want with setting up our pieces. Black with bishop h7. Now this is kind of a weird move, but it reveals black's plan. So in this position, black basically had another option, which was, at the moment, black controls all these squares, right? Like he controls all the squares in the H file, so the rooks can't come in. What he could have done was just leave his king in the middle or go to the queen side and just hold this position, right? Don't block the H file, just hold this position and ask white, what are you going to do? And that's a very good question because there's no obvious weakness right now. Like the only obvious thing is that white will need to sacrifice at some point to break through, right? Whether it's a sack on f5 or g6 or even b5, right? Maybe like we come back here and sack on b5. That's another idea. White will need to sack somehow. Maybe white has to go like knight to d3 to e5 to control this square and this square. I don't know, but this was the other option, trying to keep the king in the middle and hold this. Of course, giving white all this time is dangerous. It's not like black is guaranteed to hold this position either. He still has to find good moves and try to, parry white's threats once he comes up with them. So that was the other idea, just not playing bishop h7. The point of bishop h7 is that black is trying to block up the h file now, right? Instead of just controlling these 3 squares, he's trying to just block the h file and kind of use this guy as a pawn to control g6, right? He's trying to deter any sack on g6 in the future. It looks like a good idea at first, but leaving the bishop on h7 is also a big target, right? Because once I double up rooks, you have to wonder, okay, are you going to go back or are you going to defend the bishop, right? And to be consistent with this plan, you have to defend the bishop because otherwise you would have just left it on g8 in the first place, right? And we'll see how black does that. Queen c2, developing the queen, and king f7. So the king looks like is going back to the king side, right? Rook h3 and king g8. So this is black's plan. He moved his king up to bring his bishop back, and then he moved his king back to defend his bishop. And this is his idea. He wants to keep the bishop on h7 and just block up the h file. He's going to go rook to h8 or rook to a7 and then bishop h8. And then, he'll have as much defense as possible on h7. And if it works, then white will not be able to break through on the h file, right? It'll just be blocked up by the bishop. But that's a huge if, right? You're putting all your firepower into defending one piece. And that means you might be spread thin in other areas of the board. So that's why plans like this generally don't work out. And we'll see how white takes advantage of that. Rook to h1, doubling up. Rook to a7, adding more defense. And king to f1. So why king to f1? What is white planning next? Exactly, bishop e1, queen h2. We have 2 rooks on the h file. We want to bring our queen in the h file as well. And that will give us Alekhine's gun, and we'll have, maximum pressure on the h file. So yeah, very good. Queen e8, just adding more defense to g6. That's all black really can do at this point, just trying to, defend as much as possible. Bishop e1, making room for the queen. Bishop h8, rook to h6. So Gelfand takes a chance to, put his rook as far as possible before bringing the queen. Bishop g7, rook to h4. Notice how every single move, he improves the piece very slightly, right? The rook is on h3 before. What's a slightly better square than h3? h4, right? So he goes to h6 and he comes back to h4. This is a very small deal, but little improvements like this, they add up, over the course of the game, right? So, yeah, things like this are very typical in Grandmaster chess. They improve pieces little by little, like little things like Rook H3 to Rook H6 to Rook H4. It does take a lot of time, but that's the nice thing of this kind of situation. Your opponent has no counterplay, so you're taking as much time as you want. There's also like a psychological element when you're taking as much time because you're kind of showing your opponent like, hey, I can take as much time as possible and you can't do anything about it, right? There's like a sense of hopelessness that your opponent gets when they realize that they just can't do anything about their sad position. So yeah, they do it for not only because it's a good thing to do, but also because there's like a psychological element to taking as much time as possible. Bishop h8 back, rook to h3. So again, another slight improvement because the queen is always best in the back of Alekhine's gun, right? You want the most important piece in the back. So in case there's a capture, you're not sacrificing your queen before your rooks, right? So yeah, 2 rooks and then the queen is the best way to have Alekhine's gun. Rook to e7 and queen h2. So black has to wait. Rook to b7, rook to h6, and now the rook is kind of solidified on h6 because if you go bishop g7, well, now you just cut off the rooks and I can take here, winning a piece, right? Don't want to lose a piece in this position, so black cannot go bishop g7. Black goes rook to e7, and okay, this is kind of a key position because white's rooks and queen are kind of, they're maxed out, right? You can't really improve them anymore. The rook on h6 is on its best square possible. The rook and queen are helping that rook, so you can't improve them. The knight on f3 is also a really good piece. So whenever you're in a position like this, where you're not really sure what to do and you're wondering how to improve anything, you want to look at your worst piece on the board, right? What is white's worst piece? The bishop. Why is that white's worst piece? It's doing something here. The bishop on e1 is white's bad bishop because all his pawns are on dry squares, but here it has a very clear target, right? A textbook bad bishop doesn't mean it's a bad piece, right? Well, it's guarding b4, but more importantly, it's attacking a5, right? This rook on a7 has been tied here for the entire game, just guarding a5. So the bishop on e1 does do a good job of attacking a5. Yeah, the knight on g3, right? Every piece that white has is either controlling an important square or some kind of piece. And yeah, like the knight on f3, it can go to e5, it can go to h4. Both are very important squares. So the knight on f3 is a pretty good piece, right? The rooks and queen are obviously doing things on the h file. The bishop is attacking f5 and attacking d5. There's definitely ideas for sacrifices on these squares. So the bishop on d3 is doing as much as possible. The bishop on e1, okay, like it might not look like it, but attacking a5 is actually pretty important because either black keeps the rook stuck here forever, or they play a4, which is a very serious decision in this position. And we'll see why later. That leaves knight on g3. It's not clear what it's doing right now. Okay, sure, we're looking at f5, but the bishop at 9, it's not enough because black has 2 pawns defending. And yeah, besides that, it's not really doing anything, right? So the knight on g3 is white's worst piece, and white has to figure out how to improve it now. I think you guys had a plan earlier with the knight. That could be an idea here, but now that you know your worst piece, your job is to find, what do I do with it? Where's the best square for my piece? So what should I do in this position with the knight? Okay, you want to bring it to e5. Yeah, that's definitely an idea. That's one route. Okay, so yeah, that's a plan for sure. What would you do if black put a knight on d7? I guess, can he even do that? Let's take a look. So knight e2 to c1. Let's say rook to b7, knight to c1, rook to e7 back. Black can't do anything, so you can just take how much time you want. Knight to d3, and knight to e5. Okay, so you bring your knight to e5. Good. So let's say black does, I don't know. What can black do here? Oh, actually, there's a pretty nice trick here, I think. Maybe there's bishop to g7. Now, this does cut off the rook, but the idea is when you take, I can maybe take on e5 now, right? Because I'm unleashing an attack on your rook. So if you take my bishop, I take your rook and I win the exchange. So I think you have to take here. But now do I have... I'm not sure, because you got a position like this, right? I've sacked 2 pieces for the rook. White's probably better. White's probably winning, actually. Yeah, White's probably winning here because the knight and the 2 bishops. With the pawn on a5 being weak, I think White should win here. So I guess this doesn't work for black. Yeah, this is actually a very good plan. What else could black do to defend? Okay, what if after knight to d3, I just leave, I'm not sure, the knight something like this, right? If I bring my knight to d7, guarding e5, because now you don't want to go knight to e5. If you go here, I'm just going to trade, right? And that's one less piece I have to worry about. And black effectively gains space by trading off a pair of pieces, right? So if I go knight to d7, what do you do with your knight now? Yeah, it's not so clear exactly what to do with knight on d3 right now. So yeah, I like this plan. This is definitely an idea, bring knight to e5, but I think knight to d7 would prevent knight to e5 happening. So instead of going to d3, the other idea is to go to b3 instead. And that's exactly what happened in the game. Knight e2, rook to b7, knight to c1, rook to e7, and knight to b3. So this is White's whole idea. Now the pawn on a5 being, kind of undefended or not defended well is coming back to bite black because, well, look what happens, right? The knight and bishop are attacking a5, and all the black pieces are kind of tied up, right? The rook and the queen need to defend the bishop. Knight needs to defend the bishop. This bishop really can't help, defend a5. This knight can't defend a5. So it's just the rook, right? And that's not enough. So either black loses a pawn or they play a4, right? And both are not desirable, but it's less desirable to lose a pawn. So black went a4. Okay, why is a4 so good for white though? What does white get out of this move? Yeah, the b4 square. So a5 was controlling b4, and now that you've given it up, the b4 square becomes one of White's new squares for his knight. And that's exactly what he does. White brings the knight to d4. So this was a very nice route. Playing knight a1 is always a fun thing to do because how often did your knight go to the corner of the board, right? But Gelfand went to c1 instead, and then he went to d3, and then he went to b4 eventually. So Yeah, the knight comes to b4, and this knight on g3, which is doing nothing, suddenly has a square now, right? After forcing a4. Okay, rook to b7. Black still can do pretty much nothing, and now knight to h4. So at the moment, white doesn't go to b4 right away because c6 is well defended by the knight and the queen, but it could be an idea later, right? A lot of times in chess, you can't win off of just one weakness alone, right? Because your opponent can put pretty much all their attention to that one weakness, and you'll have a hard time breaking through somewhere where your opponent has, diverted all their attention, right? So the solution is to create a second weakness, usually on the other side of the board, and that's what I did with a4, right? Create a weakness with b4, and now potentially there's ideas for knight to b4. And the other idea is that white can play b3 at some point, opening up the queen side. So that's called the principle of two weaknesses. You're making weaknesses on both sides of the board, and there's no way black can really care for both of them, right? So that becomes an idea later. But for now, white focuses even more on the king side. Knight to h4. Attacking g6. And okay, white has a threat here. So let's say black goes just rook e7 back, completely oblivious to white's threat. How does white win the game on the spot now? Knight takes g6, yeah. And if bishop takes g6, you just hang your bishop, right? So we can't do that. What if knight takes though? Bishop h5, exactly. And there's really no good way to defend the knight. You can try rook g7, but I can probably go knight e5 here, right? Putting even more pressure. And yeah, once you take back with the bishop, I'm gonna take on h8. So I'm gonna win the piece no matter what here, right? There's nothing black can do, like knight to a6. So for example, I take here, then I take on h8, and yeah, discovered check. It gets ugly here. Okay, so rook g7 loses that. What if bishop g7? King takes. What's the rest of the line? Okay, bishop takes g6, king takes g6. So knight e5, bishop takes e5, rook h7, but then just rook takes a7, right? Because the bishop on g7 is no longer there, right? Yeah, rook takes h7, king takes h7, bishop takes g6, king takes g6. I don't know actually if white is immediately winning. I'm sure white's winning after rook h7, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. Because this takes, bishop takes, king takes, rook h7, black KO king f7 now, and run to f8, right? Queen h5, king to g8, for example. Not sure how white actually wins this. It turns out the king is surprisingly safe on g6, because knight e5, we can always just take, right? And not much progress being made here. Yeah, so yeah, not really sure how I wins this. Rook h7 is the flashier move because people see the discovered check and like, wow, this must be winning. But it turns out, the less flashy move is winning here. Yeah, just bishop takes g6. This is, not as fun as rook to e7 because you're just discovered check, but simple sometimes is best, right? We're attacking the queen, so black has to take back, and now just rook h8, right? Skewer the queen. Black cannot even take. He gets mated here, right? Takes, king to f7, knight to e5, and then queen h6 would just be mate. So black can't take. He has to go king f7, and then we just win the queen. And yeah, white should probably just win this, being he won the queen, and you're also a pawn. It's still a fortressy kind of position because white hasn't like broken through on h5 immediately, but I think, after some careful play, white should win. Maybe white goes b3 now at some point, or maybe even just knight e5, trying to grab the bishop, right? Takes, and rook h6. Maybe bring bishop in, maybe sack on g6. Black's knight b8 is very bad as well, so I think white would win this. Okay. Yeah, so bishop h5 wins the piece back by force, so that was the immediate threat. Knight takes g6, right? So that's why in the game, black went bishop g7, spotting white's threat, and Gelfand had a plan for this move as well. So how does white continue here? You're going to sack the rook somehow because it is trapped right now, right? The idea from earlier, flashy one, may work now because we have some extra pieces now. Yeah, exactly. Rook h7 works now because, if king takes, we can take on f5, which is even stronger than g6. Actually, I think taking on g6 would lead to some serious material gains because if king takes, now we have bishop h5 to win the queen, right? So king back. But now rook h8 leads to mate. Takes. Oh, not there. Whoops. Takes. And knight t5 is mate. So black cannot take with the king without getting mated, or losing the queen. So knight takes instead, which is what was played in the game. But now knight takes g6 is really strong because if queen takes, there's bishop h5 trapping the queen, and yeah, losing the queen is not a good idea. So black cannot take on g6 right away. White has sacked the exchange for winning this pawn, but we said earlier that we would even sack a piece for 2 pawns, right? So sacking in exchange for 1 pawn is definitely white's favor here. The rooks generally just aren't as good as knights and bishops in this kind of position because of the closed nature. So yeah, this trade clearly favors white. And eventually we'll see white probably getting the exchange back as well. So black tries knight to d7, trying to maneuver his knight over to f8. Notice you cannot take knight a7. Okay, well you can, but black can take the knight now because if bishop h5, you hang your rook now, right? So you got to be a little bit careful and not take on h7 too soon. White goes bishop h5 first, threatening a discovery against the queen. Queen to d8, moving away, and now knight to b4. So about 5 or 6 moves ago, like white's whole plan of forcing a4 has now come to fruition, right? Because this knight left b8, immediately we're looking at c6 now. So everything is starting to come together. Rook to c7. Whenever you have like a strong piece tied down to the defense of a pawn being attacked by a weaker piece, like the rook is stronger than the knight, well, materially at least, that's generally not a good idea for you because you don't want your stronger pieces being tied down to, mundane tasks like defending a pawn. Knight to h8. This is the real banger of this game because not every day you're gonna make a move like that and you know it's winning. So if king takes h8, well, what is White's idea? Why did White just lure the king to h8? How does White win now? Bishop f7. Yeah, this probably wins. Although knight to f8, g6. What's the idea here? Yeah, this probably wins. I was looking at bishop g6, but because knight f8 we can just take now, right? And yeah, this probably is also winning for White. Okay, bishop f7 is nice as well. I actually missed bishop f7 to be honest. I was looking at bishop g6 only, but yeah, that works. Okay, so we cannot take with the king. We have to go bishop takes. And now what is White's plan? This one is slightly less obvious. Bishop f7, yeah, and same move works twice because, well, now if king takes, it's very important that we're coming in like with check because if bishop g6, this gives black time to introduce his rooks to the defense, right? So that's why bishop f7. We're down a full rook, but we're gonna crash through bishop g6, and where's the mate? Or is there a mate even? Queen h5, king g8, and then what? I think black is okay after king g8, so maybe not queen h5. G6, yes. If g6, black cannot take because then queen h5 will lead to mate, right? Very fitting our bishop on e1 gives mates after being kind of boxed in the entire game. Gets to deliver the, nice blow. What if king to g8 though? How does white finish it off now? There's several mates here, although I think there's one that's nicer than the rest. Yeah, rook h8 is the nicest one in my opinion, because then you can play queen f7 like this. Although rook takes bishop is also completely winning, matter of taste. Black has to go here, but then we just take and okay, white's down in exchange, but there's no way you're surviving like queen h8 and g7 or something, right? Like knight f8. What's the move here? Probably rook g8 is better because then g7's coming. Yeah, black's not surviving this without some material losses, so he didn't go for this. Black tried knight df8. The whole game, black has been trying to avoid the most pressing lines, and yeah, although I don't think he had a choice here with knight to f8. So, yeah, now I can just play knight f7, which is very nice. Cool maneuver: knight h4, knight g6, knight h8, and now f7. And if you don't take, I'm coming to d6 or some other like insane square that's really deep in black's territory. Black took finally. He had enough of the knight. But that just runs into takes and then g6, right, at some point. If black went, let's say, queen c7, I can do many things here. I think the nicest is knight to d6. Like, having a knight here is just super nice, right? Look at the rooks. They're just so bad in comparison to white's knights. And yeah, I'm going bishop e8 next, maybe take on c6. White's attack is kind of like started at the king side and it's coming to the queen side from behind. So yeah, this is not fun at all. g6 will come soon eventually too. Okay, so black takes, and now nice rook takes h7 first, keeping his pawn. White could have gone g6 first, but after takes and takes, all you've done is trade off your g pawn, right? You might as well take on e7 first so you can keep your pawn alive. Knight takes, and yeah, knight takes would allow g6. So next move queen h7 is coming. So Black didn't want to take. Instead, he goes queen e8, trying to keep c6 alive, but now just rook h3. And now the dust has finally settled. The flashes are over. White's come up a pawn, and also, more importantly, like knight on b4 attacks c6. So the queen or rook is stuck defending the pawn, and the rest of the game is white just converting his extra pawn advantage. So I'll go through it pretty quickly because the rest is Gelfand showing technique to convert this. So first, what he does is he tries to just trade queens, because after trading queens and trading rooks eventually, this knight on b4 is going to be the deciding factor for the game, targeting c6. So they trade queens. After knight d3, white's trying to get bishop a5 and bishop b6, and then knight b4 back. So black has to stop it with rook a7, and now we bring the king in, bring the knight back, kings come over, and eventually b3 is coming, because that's the other drawback of a4. You're allowing b3 to open up the queen side. Oops. Rook h7, b3. So white's playing on both sides of the board. Rook comes down, and then also b3. Knight to f8, rook back, takes, king e8, rook to a2. So we bring the rook back to finally play a4. And once a4 is played, we trade the rooks off, and it's going to be game over. Takes, and takes. Black could have tried keeping the rooks on, but I'm going to play rook a7 anyway, and then you have to trade regardless, right? So he just does it now. And yeah, the bishop comes in, the knight comes to b4, and the knight's coming in, from behind. King to c8, bishop c7, bishop f8, and yeah, this knight ending is pretty simply winning because the passed pawn is going to be too much. We bring the knight here to push our pawn, g6, g7, and here finally black resigns, because eventually black will be some sort of zugzwang, because let's say knight to g8, white goes knight to f7, and now this guy cannot move, right? Because if you move, I go knight to h6. So you got to move your king. If you go king c7, I'm going to go king a6 and then come in this way. If you go king to a7, I go knight to g5, picking up a second pawn, and then a third pawn eventually. And yeah, black's pawns just start collapsing. So black decided to just resign here after g7. So yeah, that's the game. Gelfand versus Wang Yui. This was a pretty classic game because Gelfand played very slowly after getting the advantage and slowly improved every piece. Eventually, there were some tactics. He crashed through, winning a pawn. And yeah, once he won the pawn, it was just back to the slow grind. Convert the extra pawn to win the game. Okay, so that was the game. I hope you guys found it instructive. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed today's class. Any questions before we sign off? All right, if not, then take care, everyone, and have a good rest of your weekend. I enjoyed showing you guys this game. All right, bye, everyone.